All right, hello, and welcome to Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival 2022. Welcome also to all those joining on Zoom, including those throughout New South Wales who are watching from your local library or at home, courtesy of your local library. It is my great honour to acknowledge that the land on which we're meeting today is Gadigal land, and to reflect that we're gathering here to share stories in a place with a rich history of storytelling and knowledge sharing. I'd like to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as to any First Nations people here in the audience today. Just some practical details before we get going. Can we make sure that all our phones are switched to silent or turned off so that there are no interruptions to today's event? We do request that you don't record the session, and if you are going to take pictures, just make sure that your flashes are off. And feel free to share on social media at Bad Crime Sydney and hashtag Bad Crime Sydney 22. I do just need to tell you quickly that in the unlikely event of an emergency evacuation, we will leave back through the door through which you entered. We'll exit via the Mitchell vestibule main doors and down the front stairs to an assembly point in the domain, and our security guards will help you and direct you. So just follow their instructions. All right, my name's Anna Downs. I'm an author. I've got 2 books, The Safe Place and The Shadow House. And I am absolutely delighted. I'm so excited to welcome you to the Dixon Room today and to be moderating such an incredible panel with these incredibly talented and distinguished authors and just generally wonderful human beings. And may I also say what a pleasure it is and what a delight it is to see so many other female crime writers in the audience today. Welcome to this wonderful discussion. I will introduce you in a second. I will just let you know that we'll be speaking for about 45 minutes and have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions after the chat. If you're joining us on Zoom, please send your questions through using the chat function about 20 minutes before the end of the session, and we'll do our absolute best to include them. All right, so today we are discussing the changing roles of women in crime fiction. I'm so excited to be chairing this chat with particular reference to the wonderful work of these 3 authors. Please join me in welcoming Anna Snoekstra, Petronella McGovern, and Rae Cairns. All right, so Anna Snoekstra is an award-winning author and screenwriter based in Melbourne. She's the author of Only Daughter, Little Secrets, and The Spite Game. Her first audio drama, This Isn't Happening, is out with Audible late 2022. Do we have a date or a month?
Just come to 2023, unfortunately.
Oh, push back to 2023.
But yes, not too far away.
Okay. And her fantastic new novel, Out of Breath, is out right now and is down in the library bookshop. Petronella McGovern grew up on a farm in the Central West region of New South Wales and now lives on the northern beaches with her husband and 2 children. Her debut novel, 6 Minutes, was published in 2019, shortlisted for the 2020 Ned Kelly Awards and the Davitt Awards, as well as longlisted for the 2020 Australian Independent Bookseller Awards. Her second novel, The Good Teacher, came out in 2020 and was longlisted for the 2021 Sisters in Crime Davitt Awards. Her third book, The Liars, hit shelves 2 weeks ago?
Last
Tuesday. You would have thought I'd know that. Rae Cairns is a former youth worker whose debut novel, The Good Mother, published earlier this year and shortlisted for Best Debut Crime Fiction in the 2021 Ned Kelly Awards, draws on her experiences mentoring disadvantaged youth in Northern Ireland during the final years of the Troubles. Rae has also co-managed a crisis refuge for street children, as well as working as a program director for the Sydney Olympic Youth Camp, and holds a degree in performing arts. And she's currently busy writing a second novel. Welcome, guys. What an amazing thing it is that we're sitting up here today. Okay, so I'm as I've said about 4 times already, I'm really excited to be here talking about women in crime fiction. It's a real honor, especially because I do think that we're in the middle of a really exciting period of change that's pushing a shift in how women are portrayed in literature. Over the last 100 years or so of crime writing, female characters have steadily gone from secondary players to primary, from enactments of male fantasy and gender stereotypes to very real and complex people with rich and complex inner lives of their own. where we used to have an abundance of femme fatales, hapless wives who didn't understand their husband, their cop husbands' jobs, and saintly dead or missing girls who catalyze the epic journeys of male characters, we now have hordes of kick-ass action heroines, leading professionals, dogged investigators, single mothers, solo female travelers, and vigilantes, women whose journeys are every bit as epic, valuable, nuanced, and adrenaline-fueled as those of their male counterparts. We're seeing women positioned much less in supporting roles, much more taking the lead and risking their lives, burrowing for the truth, cracking the enigmas of identity, and fighting back against the murderous stresses of everyday life. And this shift is very much reflected by these three fantastic books. I wondered if we could just kick off, if we just go along the line and each of you just give us a synopsis or pitch of the book and describe the world in which they're set.
Okay, The Good Mother is a thriller about a divorced Australian soccer mum of 3 who's keeping secrets from everyone she loves. The story opens when her 16-year-old son, Riley, tells her he's been selected to represent Australia at an international soccer camp in the Republic of Ireland, and she won't let him go. So her ex-husband steps in, insists they allow their son to follow his dreams. Riley heads off, but his arrival through customs in Dublin triggers 2 men from Northern Ireland to hunt Sarah down. One's an obsessive policeman who's determined to uncover secrets he believes she's been keeping since she was an aid worker in 1990s Belfast. And the other is an IRA executioner who threatens the lives of her children unless she does exactly as he says.
I'll just let you absorb that. The Liars is also a thriller set in the small town of Kinta Bay, which is a seaside town. It's just been through the pandemic and the floods and the bushfires, and it's bouncing back. The tourists are finally coming back. And then a 16-year-old schoolgirl, 15-year-old schoolgirl finds a skull in the national park. She thinks it's related to an Aboriginal massacre by the town founder, which no one wants to talk about. So she films it, sends it to the media, it goes viral, and it's on the TV news that night, and the whole town is instantly divided. In the meantime, her mother, Mary, is a local journalist, and she thinks the skull is related to a schoolmate who went missing in the 1990s. They used to have teenage parties out there in the national park next to the killing cave, and these parties always ended badly. So as the police start to investigate, the family and the community, the whole town, have to work out who's telling the truth and who are the liars.
Ooh. Amazing. So my book is Out of Breath. So it's about a young woman who's she's English, and she's has to do 88 days farm work, so three months of farm work in order to extend her visa in Australia, her working holiday visa. And so she goes to a mango farm in the Kimberley region of Western Australia. And the conditions there aren't great. And she meets a young man and also an older woman who live on an off-the-grid community in the Kimberley. And it's a very isolated community. And she's told that this woman can help heal people. And she's a very broken person, kind of looking for a sense of belonging, looking for some kind of solace that way. And so she, in a moment of despair, decides to go and join this community. But of course, because it's crime, it's not all that it seems, and maybe not as idyllic as you might imagine.
And they're all 3 of them are really wonderful books, and so kind of interesting and adrenaline fueled, all in their own ways. All 3 feature protagonists who are kind of working alone, and they're all very, very strong in their own ways, but they're all struggling with demons and their own things that they're haunted by, things that they're trying to unravel. And I think that particularly this this whole thing of female characters striking out on their own it's occurring more and more frequently. I wrote a piece for Crime Reads not that long ago, and about the fact that I'd observed that last year there was a whole slew of books where female characters were embodying these action hero roles. And very interestingly, I read an interview with Karen Slaughter just recently, who said this about women in crime fiction. She said, for a long time, strong women were portrayed as having masculine attributes. They're smoking cigarettes and wearing leather and driving motorcycles. And now women can write in a way that is true to the real strength of women rather than the fantasy. And Rae, your character, Sarah, is the perfect example of that, because she's stepping into a role and a world that is typically inhabited by male action heroes, but she doesn't dial down the feminine either. And I think her strength really is that true strength that Karen Slaughter was talking about. Why don't you tell us more about Sarah and why you wanted to write her and the story in that way?
I didn't intend to write a mother action hero. I just wanted to write a ordinary woman who had a traumatic past, who was operating from a place of fear, and who had committed to doing anything to protect her children, and kind of the journey that she went on with that. At the time I sat down to write, I felt that a lot of crime fiction, mothers in crime fiction, were kind of supporting characters. This is quite a few years ago when I started. Supporting characters with not a lot of depth to them, or they were professionals, but their children didn't kind of play much of a role, or they were the cause of the main character's trauma and stuff. So, and in my experience, in times of crisis, it was ordinary women and especially mothers that stepped up and showed tenacity and showed resourcefulness. So I guess I really wanted to delve into the kind of that inner strength. And so I wanted to take an ordinary person and throw her into extraordinary circumstances and see what came out.
Yeah, and I think as well that there's something that really spoke to me, was that on occasion parenting has felt to me a little bit like, a battlefield, but you don't get the same kind of recognition. And I do think that now, we are talking so much more about the very real struggles of motherhood. We're up until this point, there's been a real push culturally for us not to be honest, and people don't want to hear that we're not enjoying it, or that we find it hard. People want us to say it's glorious, it's wonderful, we're loving it. And now there's so much more opportunity for us to say, well, actually, it's a mixed bag, and here are the negatives. And it's hard, it's really hard work. And I think that's what Sarah's doing, is she's really battling through some extraordinary stuff.
Yeah, but nobody knows she's got extraordinary stuff in her past. She hasn't shared that, and so she is she appears to be very controlling and trying to contain her children, and she's very risk adverse, and you don't really understand what that's about. And so the people in her life underestimate her, and there's a lot of judgment sent her way. And that's something I wanted to explore, because I think there is and has been a fair bit of judgment of mothers and their behaviour without really understanding the individual beneath that. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Petronella, your main character, Mary, is similarly, she's a multitasking mother, desperate to protect her child, but she's many more things than that as well. We see her throughout the course of the book as a journalist. We see her as a friend, a member of the community. We see her as a wife. And through her diary entries, we also see her as a young girl, which is really interesting, because she's in the midst of parenting a teenage daughter herself, all of which makes her incredibly relatable. And I think this segues quite nicely with what Rae was saying, because this concept of an ordinary person battling through horrible shit is kind of what we want to see from heroes, I think, at the moment. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about Mary, but why do you think that relatability, as opposed to maybe likability, is such an important part of writing female characters at the moment? And then I might ask you a side question after that.
Well, I think it's part of what you just said. Mary, my character, is a journalist, and something happened to her when she was 15 at the killing cave at these teenage parties, and now her daughter's 15, and she has become the overprotective mum. She's worried, and she's reliving these things that have happened to her, and she doesn't want her daughter to have the same, terrible experience she had. But I think the thing about relatability and likability, like there was always this thing that characters had to be likable, and particularly women had to be nice and likable. And like you say, with parenting, we've sort of gone past that point. Now we want characters we understand who reflect some of what we're going through. I mean, not all of what we're going through, but part of that. And I think part of Mary's is the parenting, but also the female ambition. She always wanted to leave the town, but she had to stay and look after her mother, and things happened. And she never got to be the BBC journalist in London, which is what she wanted to be. She's the local town journalist. And I think that reflects, a lot of women's experiences of ambition, trying to juggle that with family, juggling that with things that have happened in the past. And with Me Too, we look back and we go, oh, we did have some of that horrible shit happen to all of us. And now we recognise it for what it is. And so, yes, I guess we want to see that reflected, that vulnerability, the flaws and parts of us that are in the story.
Yeah, and we were saying in the green room just before as well that a common theme that binds these three books together is motherhood in different ways. Your main character is not a mother herself, but motherhood is very much, weaved into the plot. And, motherhood for many women it's not an easy thing to write about, but it is something that many of us cannot help but write about. And Petronella, given that you wrote this book whilst parenting your own 15, 16-year-old daughter, how much do you think that, mining our own experiences and sometimes that can feel like gouging out our guts and spreading them on the page, but, how much do you think that is part of our job as a writer? How pressured do you feel to do that, or how essential do you think that is to your writing?
Well, she's definitely not my daughter in the book, and I'm not Mary, so we'll get that straight. So I feel like we draw on our own personal experiences, but but I think more about the emotion and the feeling rather than the actual story of our own lives necessarily. And I mean, certainly for the 15-year-old teenager, I was looking around and looking at Greta Thunberg, the teenager in the book is a teenage activist. She's campaigning for the truth. She's campaigning for a number of social environmental issues. And I was really interested in that passion and determination of teenagers. And so, which is not my daughter.
Just quietly.
I mean, sorry, she's not a campaigner. She's not listening on Zoom. It's okay. But she has passion about other things, about writing and art. But to see some teenagers today who are so passionate, I was sort of inspired by what I saw, at school, at certain friends, and so not necessarily mining your own experiences, but what you see and hear around you, but using your own emotional experience, I think, as well.
Yeah, beautiful. And Out of Breath follows Jo, a young woman who is similarly looking to peel back the layers of her own life, but even as she is running from them. Throughout the book, she's unpicking certain narratives about her life, things that she's always accepted as true, which means that in addition to solving an actual crime, she's also piecing together the arguably more urgent mystery of who she really is. And I'd like you to tell us a bit more about Jo, but particularly, why is that kind of arc, that's about self-investigation, where, sort of girlhood and womanhood are cold cases in themselves, and that kind of character, lost, flawed, isolated, put in a position where they have to rescue themselves. Why is that? Why are those two things appearing in crime fiction with increasing frequency, do you think?
Okay, I'm going to kind of go around that. I love the way you phrased that question. Those so beautiful, cold cases in themselves. to touch on the motherhood side of it, which I think unpicks my character's Jo's journey in this. I was interested in writing about, because you often see motherhood presented as in your books, this force, mothers as these people that will do anything to protect their children. Well, I wanted to do it kind of the opposite way, show a really kind of ugly, broken side of motherhood and what that looks like. So it starts off with Jo losing a pregnancy, which really informs the whole book. And the crime that Anna mentioned, which I didn't mention when I talked about the book to begin with, is a mother and daughter that are missing in the area of Broome, which comes back into it. But so she loses her pregnancy, and so she's kind of constantly looking to mother people that she meets, children that she meets along the way. And then we start to learn more about her own mother, who she was taken off from as a child and sent to live with her father. It was really an abusive relationship with her mother. And I just thought it was really interesting to think about what that looks like, about, when motherhood is broken, when it's just such an integral part of people, and broken from her own mother, but also passing that down to broken when she thinks that she's going to become a mother, and feels very, very alone after that at the beginning of the book, because I think that it's something that a lot of women go through, losing pregnancies and things like that. But I don't see it in fiction that often compared to how frequent it is that women go through it. And I really, really wanted to when you do see it, especially in TV and stuff, it's often just a problem solver. Like, oh no, she's gotten pregnant and she shouldn't be pregnant, and then she had a miscarriage, so everything's okay. And so you see it again and again. And I really wanted to write a book that really got in deep about the long-term effects. It's not something that just disappears. What that looks like on multiple levels, thematically, and in terms of a story. So she starts off as Jo, but when we see her whole story, we see that she's kind of getting smaller and smaller. So as a child, she was Josephine, then she becomes Josie. She keeps running, she becomes Jo. When she joins this group, she starts being called J. So literally getting smaller and smaller until she's just a single letter. And in terms of that question about why these kinds of stories that get into this kind of often quite nasty, or I don't want to say ugly, but things that we don't necessarily often see or don't want to see. I think that people have always wanted these kind of stories. I think women have always wanted these kind of stories. I know I always have. And now we're just seeing them published more, which I think is fantastic. I think that the connection between what women want to read and what is being published is kind of connecting a little bit more with this kind of drive of women writing crime stories. I remember the first crime novel I read that was written by a woman, because you often get, as you were saying in the beginginning, that kind of cliche of the male detective and the alcohol, and the woman is just like a really throwaway kind of victim character. When I read a woman's version of crime fiction, I just was like, yes, it just clicked inside me, and I thought, this is exactly what I want to read, and it's exactly what I want to write. So I was really looking for those stories, and I was Googling it, going, what are, writers like Tana French and Gillian Flynn, and, trying to find them. And I think that publishers are recognizing that appetite for these stories that kind of go into the psyche of the real psyche, which isn't necessarily pretty, of what it means to be a woman, and what women face. And I think that's why we're seeing more of them. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, I do too. And I think as well, there's something going on collectively with us as well. The last kind of 10 years in particular, there's such a lot of self-excavation and so many things, like Me Too, that throws our experiences into a different light. So we're all collectively kind of going, I've been told this is what femininity is. I've been told this is what it means to be a woman, but that doesn't feel right to me. So then, I feel like collectively we're all doing a little bit of digging. And that to me is also why we have so many of these stories. Were you kind of playing with that at all deliberately?
Yeah, not wanting to look at, what's not often seen, what's not pretty. And I think all of our books do that really well, like look into like shame and guilt, and the looking back as well. I think all the three books look back into things that have happened in the past that women haven't wanted to deal with for various reasons, and really having to face them, and putting that on the page, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah, and having those things explode into your peaceful present. Rae, speaking to that a little bit, I read an interview with American crime author Renee Denfield just recently, and she said this. She said, most women experience violence at some point in their lives. I think this is part of the appeal of crime fiction. We are processing trauma. Given that The Good Mother was inspired by your own personal experiences working in Northern Ireland, how much does that resonate with you as a writer and perhaps also as a reader?
Hugely. I think I write crime and read crime to make sense of the world around me and to kind of gain an insight into why people do what they do, because I can't always understand that. The beauty of being a crime writer is I can control the ending, and I can't do that in real life, unfortunately. For me, when I started writing The Good Mother, I didn't kind of connect it that it would also be somewhat processing things that I went through, because I worked in Northern Ireland during the final years of the Troubles. So I took children from the paramilitaries like the IRA and the UVF away on camps together. And so I saw things and heard things and experienced things that were out of the realm of my experience within Australia. And so when I got home, I just literally boxed it all up. The photos, the mementos, the feelings, the memories, all went in a box under my bed, and I didn't look at it for 20 years. And it was only when I came to writing, and then all of a sudden I was having to process stuff. So I think there was more of a connection to that processing trauma than I realized. I mean, there's a riot scene in the book, and I first wrote it and I did it really clinically, and it was absolute rubbish. So then I kind of had to really let myself go into the experience of being at a riot and how that felt, that the emotions and the visceral kind of reactions, and really revisit that and then layer that into it. So sorry, back to your question about trauma. Yeah, look, The Good Mother definitely deals with trauma, how people respond to it, how people process it.
And as a former actor as well, you do kind of take, part of your writing process is taking some of that into your body a little bit and kind of walking it around.
Absolutely. Like I get up and block out my scenes. When it's coming to write a fairly emotional scene, as an actor, I used to run an internal monologue in my head, like a stream of consciousness kind of thing, and that would bring about visceral reactions in my body. So I do the same when I'm writing. If it's a highly emotional, frightening, whatever scene, I do the same thing, run that monologue and feel the scene in my body. Yeah,
that's so interesting. Just kind of going back to violence and trauma. Petronella, there are some heinous acts of violence in your book, particularly committed against women. But I would say that you have chosen not to describe those explicitly, which is a choice that a lot of us grapple with. And it's kind of a bit of a hot topic, I would have said, at the moment. I don't know if any of you know, there's a prize that was announced a few years ago called the Staunch Prize in the UK, which is a prize awarded to, and I don't have the quote from the website, but it's basically awarded to books that feature no violence against a woman at all, no rape, no sexual assault, no violence of any kind against a woman. And I don't know if any of you were in the panel immediately before this, but there was a very interesting comment that one of the panelists made, which is that he said, in my work there are no female victims. And it's interesting because then if you look at somebody like, Karen Slaughter is a massive advocate for confrontational, full-on, in-your-face depictions of violence against women, because she says it's real, it's not sexy, it's not pretty, it's horrendous, and we need to confront the darkness head on. So with the violence against women in your book, can you talk us through your process around making that choice and what made you want to tackle that particular story in the first place?
so I did grapple with it. And I think in an early scene, someone read it and they said, well, you're not showing the violence. And I went, I don't want to show the violence. I think part of it is I'm more interested in the aftermath, which is what we had a session yesterday with Mercedes about the aftermath of the violence, and that's, you know, how people cope, how people pick it up, and as the title of the book is, how people lie about it, how they hide it. You know, both the perpetrators and the victims are, you know, hiding it or dealing with it in a certain way. So I think that's really what interested me to look at in terms of story. But I think it is hard because there is an aspect you want to show you want to show the reality of what happens, but you don't want to glorify it. You don't want to desensitize the reader. But I feel we see enough of it on TV, on the TV news, in the newspaper. I still remember a newspaper article I read 5 years ago, and perhaps my imagination is just too strong. And every time I think about this article, I feel sick. So I feel like the reader has an imagination. They can imagine what's happened, and then let's move on to actually, you know, how these characters are coping with the situation. In terms of why I chose to tackle this topic, there's a number of different topics, a number of different types of violence, but sort of one of the main storylines, when my daughter turned 15 and started talking about going to teenage parties, I remembered my own teenage parties, and I thought, oh, it's okay, things have changed since I was 15 and girls are treated better. Anyway, and then she started saying a few things, and then we had the Chanel, this was like, so was the beginning of 2020, the Chanel contest in the sexual assault in the eastern suburbs, teenage parties, private schools. Then we had Brittany Higgins in Parliament House, and then we're out there marching for justice for women again, ending up at Parliament House just up the road there. And I went, it hasn't changed. And so I had actually planned to write a story about change, and instead I've written a story about parallels across 3 different timelines in history of violence against women. But so, it's not, I'm making it sound very depressing. It's not that depressing.
No, it's not. No.
There is hope. There's hope.
There is hope. It's hopeful. It's invigorating. It's wonderful. Where do you, like, any of you can jump in on this. I could talk about that particular question of, you know, how to depict violence against women for weeks. Where do you sit on that scale? You know, Staunch Prize to Karen Slaughter, you know, where do you sit there? Because I guess, you know, it's absolutely fantastic that we're all saying, hey, there's too much of this. There's too much violence against women. We are desensitizing ourselves. But if you then ask for it to be taken out, aren't we erasing it? Don't we run the risk of doing that? What do you reckon?
I think it needs to serve the story and the character journey. It really needs to not be gratuitous and also not desensitizing. So I'm a little bit on I see enough of it on the news and stuff, but I also, I sit right in the middle, unfortunately. So it would come down to the story for me and the character and what rang true there. I don't think I could just make a blanket decision on it for me personally.
Yeah, I agree. I think with the Staunch Prize, I think it's an interesting one. Someone said the best way to do that is just to not have any women characters in it at all. I think I can understand it existing though, because I think it's nice to have that option of, okay, I can pick up this book and know that it's not, I don't have to face this with reading this book, because it can just become so exhausting. I also had some really interesting conversations after the Brittany Higgins case came to light with some people from my work. We sat down and for some reason all the men left and it was just the 4 of us. And it was, so me in my 30s and woman in 40s, 50s and 60s. And we all had a story, not just of something happening, but of not speaking up. And it was so interesting seeing just all these generations and the way it just come through. And of course, we'll keep going down. So I do think, of course, we can't not speak about it. And it makes me think of something like Law and Order, SVU, that TV show, which can be very exploitative, but the main viewership of that is women wanting to watch these stories about sexual assault and wanting to see that potential catharsis of it being dealt with. And it really surprised me that it was just almost exclusively women that watch that show. And women often find it really, cathartic, and it makes them feel better to watch it. And I think there's something in that. It makes people feel better to not pretend that it's not there. I think that sometimes you feel like you have to pretend that it's not something that women face every day when they're walking around, that if not actually, but just that fear that's always there, and being able to recognize that and not shy away from it can be kind of just a bit of a relief, just as it can be a relief to read a book where you don't have to face it, just a relief to just acknowledge that that's what's really happening, because otherwise it can feel a bit gaslighty. I think that you just kind of, it's not something that you're actually facing, every time you walk down the street. It's acknowledging that fear and that that's real and legitimate, I think is very powerful.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is also, in terms of how we tell stories, with particular reference to all the many, many TV shows that over the last however many years, have started with a beautiful, usually white, dead woman that has kickstarted it. I guess it's about thinking creatively about how we can utilize violence against women in our storytelling for the good, rather than as a plot device that kickstarts someone else's story. It's the treatment of it that I think is important. But pivoting from violence of the body to more violence of the mind, Anna, Out of Breath, the crimes in Out of Breath, and there are quite a few, there's not just this kind of one central crime. They're very nuanced, and to me they feel unnervingly intimate. There's a lot of blurred lines and a lot of coercion, manipulation, there's a lot of isolation, and for Jo, the main character, there's many times where she questions herself. She's not quite sure what's happening within her own mind. And I'm kind of really interested into what leads you to write about that kind of psychological brutality. But I want to kind of link it to another conversation that we were having in the green room, which is about because you do kind of write more in a psychological thriller space than perhaps a straight up crime space, if you want to kind of box things into genre boxes. And we've had such a slew of psychological thrillers where, you have these unreliable narrators, and you have these women who don't know what to believe and who are questioning their own thoughts, their own mind, that they're being gaslit, and you're put in their heads for the duration of the book. So, the kind of the entertainment, the thrill is what's real and what isn't, which is fantastic because it feeds into a lot of what we were talking about, getting into the mess of the mind and not sanitizing everything and presenting lots and lots and lots of different experiences. But I was kind of wondering whether or not we might have tipped over it into potentially an unhealthy place, in that, are we running the risk of presenting women as a bit crazy? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
right.
For sure. I feel a bit crazy most of the time.
You've got a small baby. I do not blame you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you've got to be so careful when you start talking about psychological stuff, because you don't want to do that thing where, there was that really popular genre in the 40s, the paranoid women's genre, literally called the paranoid women's genre. It's like, is her husband trying to kill her, or is she just a bit paranoid? That was literally the genre. And so you've got to be careful with that. And you've also got to be careful as kind of using mental illness, like legitimate mental illness, as a plot device, which I think there's a lot of problems with that. And you do see that in psychological thrillers happening quite a lot. The twist, she's actually got multiple personality. I actually read one that which I thought we didn't see multiple personality anymore, but it was there. Gave me a real surprise. But yeah, so you don't want to treat mental illness as like a plot twist. I think that is just not okay. I think that as people that write these kind of darker stories, especially that are more psychological, you just have to be very aware and conscious of that kind of thing. Take that responsibility seriously if you're going to go there. I mean, for me, it's more when you say, I think you said psychological brutality, which I think is really such an interesting term of phrase, it's more someone intentionally trying to kind of basically mess with this girl's head intentionally as an act of, I guess, psychological violence. It was based partly off the satanic panic of the 80s, where there was all that like suggestion, and the power of that suggestion could make people believe things had happened even if they hadn't necessarily happened. And also I was very, I don't want to say inspired, that feels like the wrong word, with Teal. Has anyone here heard of Teal Swan? Teal Swan, yes. So she is basically a cult leader who started on YouTube. So she started with these YouTube kind of sermons, and then it grew and grew and grew, and eventually she became like a real world cult leader of people that would actually come, I think it's somewhere in South America, to her place, and she gets a lot of money in it, but a lot of it is online, which I found really interesting. But she has part of her practice, I don't know if practice is the right word, and I watched a session, because she does them online as well and puts them on YouTube, where she delves into people's subconscious and starts telling them what she sees, and what she sees doesn't seem to be what actually happened. And I think messing with someone's brain like that and creating those false memories, which actually, once you start doing that, isn't that difficult. It's quite scary how fragile we actually are psychologically if someone is trying to do you harm and is very smart about it. So I saw that, and I watched a few of these sessions, and it was very overwhelming to watch and very interesting. And so that's kind of what I wanted to bring into this, is that, I guess, coercive control as well, and really that brutality psychologically, rather than actual physical violence, but how powerful that psychological brutality can be, rather than just the threat of physical violence, which there is a bit of physical violence in here as well, but it's not really the point of it, and doesn't really happen against the main character at all, I don't think. Not really. Well, spoiler, sorry. She doesn't die at the end. But I just thought
She
it was
dies in the middle. No.
Yeah, she dies in the middle. I just thought it was an interesting thing that I hadn't seen before, that I've always been really interested in.
Yeah, and I think as well, what that makes me think of as well is how many of us are hungry for that as well. How malleable our minds are, and how so many of us want to be told what our thoughts mean and what our memories are. Hence why we have so many cults. There are so many vulnerable people that kind of really want that as well, which is a scary thing in itself. Hey, listen, we've kind of, I think, got about 20 minutes left. So if anybody does have some questions in a little while, we will be throwing it open. So why don't you start having a think about anything that you'd might like to ask these guys. I've just got a few more questions that maybe we could just bat around as a chat. So all three books are led by female heroes who are fighting against adversity, and they refuse to be victims. But it could be argued as well that the villains in the books, the perpetrators, they're also fighting adversity, aren't they? I think that the way that you've written them means that we kind of understand where they're coming from and why they're doing what they're doing. Do you think that they are victims too? And what's the kind of interplay of victimhood and perpetration in your books? What are you doing there?
I absolutely, but I don't like to think of them as villains. They're antagonists to me, and they are damaged people. I mean, in my book, they've lived through 30 plus years of violent conflict. There's generational trauma. So I suppose for me, I try to view each character as like the hero of their own stories. So they need to, I don't know, write a mustache twirling, villain. I want someone who's just as motivated and by goals as the main character.
Yeah, I agree with what you say, and certainly in the Lies, I have a theme about toxic masculinity and how that affects men as much as it affects women, and some of the so-called villains are these men who've been, terrorized by friends, and they have to live up to this hyper masculine behavior that they have to subvert their own emotions and their own talents and the way they want to live their own lives, and they have to squash that to live up to this sort of male expectation in the story. And I do have violence against men in my story too.
Yes, there is violence against men as well, and you're absolutely right. You know, it affects everybody. What do you reckon?
Well, I mean, I guess for me, almost towards the end, you're not sure who the villain is for a while. So I won't talk about that antagonist. But early on, the farmer is, I guess, an antagonistic force. And it would have been very easy, I think, to write that, really quintessential, like Wolf Creek style, that kind of version of an Australian man. But I didn't want to do that because I didn't think it was really fair to these farmers who are doing this 88-day visa program. So I spent a lot of time on, apart from actually talking to people, on this farmer Facebook page called The Other Side of the Story, where they basically just bitch about the backpackers that come and work for them. And it was really good, and it was really interesting hearing the way they actually talk to each other, because when they talk to me, obviously it's very different, and I got a real sense of the situation that they're in, and I found their voice is actually kind of funny and interesting, and so I find the Denny character in this, the farmer, for me, when I was writing him, he was making me giggle. So I don't know if other people found it that way, but yeah. So I guess I didn't want it to be just like this bad Wolf Creek evil Australian man. No,
and I think you do that so well. Like so many of your characters, and your parts of the turns of the story. They lean very much, a little bit this way, but they don't actually, you're not actually tipping over to Wolf Creek. I think particularly all that farm section is so vivid and so real in my mind. And but some of the characters there, the people that she's at the farm with, particularly the German guy, Elias, isn't it?
Yeah,
I loved him. I'm not going to tell you anything about what happens to any of them, but I just loved him. I think you did that so well. You spent some time, didn't you, on a mango farm?
I went to a mango farm in Broome, which was really fun. I also I know we've not got much time, but very quickly I was trying to, this is very stupid and embarrassing, I tried to go undercover as a worker on one of these farms, and it didn't really work out. But yes, the character of Denny is very based on this guy who was running this hostel. And he just would say something, he'd just stare at you for ages, and you would be like, I don't know what you want me to say back. It was silly. I was silly, but yeah, too long a story.
Love it. Brilliant. Do you think, this is kind of a potentially a slightly weird question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think that being a woman affects how you write perpetrators? I heard someone ask that to some female writers on a radio interview recently, and the answers were really interesting. Their reactions were interesting. I thought, I'm going to throw that out. I'm going to see what they say. Do you think?
Yes. That's all I have. Yes.
How so, Petronella? Please elaborate.
Well, I don't. Well, for me personally, I'm interested in the psychology, more in why, as Rae said before, more in why, the reasons why people do the things they do. And I think sometimes men are more interested in the action side of things than the but that's a generalization. I'll stop now.
All right, I'm going to move us into slightly less sketchy territory before I do go. And we're on to questions. Yeah, great. Let's do questions.
I've got a question by Zoom from Helen Pokinghorn. This is multi-part, so we'll try our best. How long did it take each of you to write your book? Have you written books with real women protagonists before, and how were they received by publishers? Have you noticed any changes in you or the publishers in this regard?
Right. What was the first part of that question?
The first part of the question was, how long did it take each of you to write your book?
All right, how long? What are we looking at? How long?
First draft, 8 months, but then years of working on it and trying to get it to a place where anyone could read it, where it was fit to be read.
2 years.
Yeah, maybe about that. I'm not sure. I was writing a book a year before this, and I think one of the other questions was how many. So I had 4 books before this. So I was doing a book a year, and then there was a 4-year gap before this one. So, yeah.
And then what was the second part of it? Something about how it's been
Have you
received?
written books with real women protagonists before, and how that were they received by publishers?
Right. So I think that's a question about kind of that relatability or that desanitization of women's inner thoughts and feelings. Like, have you tackled that before, and how did publishers or readers respond?
Yes, I've tackled it before, and I think as we've seen from the festival and from the books that are being published, that publishers love books by women about crime, about psychological thriller, about the inside emotion of what's happening. So yeah, I think they're being really well received, and the publishers in the front here are nodding their heads furiously.
And the third part is, have you noticed any changes in you or the publishers in this regard?
Noticed any changes as in are people responding differently now to those kinds of stories? I wonder, what do you think? Like, is there any change? Are we noticing any slightly different feedback of maybe publishers or readers starting to say, well, I'm a bit bored of that storyline, I want something else? Or are you still feeling the hunger for it?
I feel like it's broadened since my first book came out 2016, but I got the publishing contract in 2014. And it was very like, so every book was girl, every crime book was, trying to be like Gone Girl or Girl on the Train. It was girl, girl, girl. That was how you knew it was a female crime book. And it was very focused on this like domestic suspense thing. But now I think this is just my opinion from what I've seen as a non-publisher, but it seems to have broadened a lot more. So you can have all types of stories. It doesn't have to be domestic suspense. You can have like female action heroes, within crime, or, fruit pickers, or, it doesn't have to be within the home so much. So in my experience, it's broadened. I don't know if you have different opinions.
I mean, I've only got one book, so, but I was pitching it, I think 2017 or something, and I didn't get picked up by a publisher, and I had 2 agents within that time. And so, there was interest in the story and stuff somewhat, but I think that the landscape has changed considerably. And then I was lucky enough to get shortlisted for the Ned Kellys, and that kind of made people sit up and look at my book a bit more. I think because it was a mother in that action role. Yeah, it's definitely changed, and certainly for me, because now I'm traditionally published.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have any questions from the floor at all? Is there anybody? Yes, hello.
Excuse me. I'm Rae's publisher, but I should make that really clear. I'm Roberta. I'm Rae's publisher. I always like to describe Rae's heroine as a Sarah Connors from the Terminator in a Lee Child novel. So that whole idea of a hero, a really kick-ass hero. So with that in mind, now that we're seeing the demand for content into streaming and seeing books go to film, there's just so much demand there. I'd love to know how you see your protagonist. Which actor would you like to play your character?
Fabulous
your
question.
protagonist.
Jessica Chastain. I guess she's kind of really cool and tough, and she can do it all. I don't know if she can do an Australian accent though.
It only came out last week, Roberta. I haven't thought about it yet.
You've lived with it for 2 years.
I know, but it's my own picture in my own head. Anyone who's determined.
Who would you have?
So it'd have to be someone English. Why not Anna? She's an actress. She do a great job.
It's kind of a joke because I narrated Anna's audiobook.
Yeah.
So if you go and get it on Audible, the narrator is me. So I know it really, really well. And I feel a little protective over that role. I think it's mine. So
yeah, exactly.
Definitely,
Anna's claimed it. So if there's any producers here.
Any other questions?
Female writers have a different take on justice for villains and perpetrators? When they write a villain and perpetrator, are they a bit kinder in how, justice plays out in the novel?
Such a good question. Any responses immediately?
I think female writers are trying to really understand the mindset of perpetrators. It goes back to what you said earlier about kind of getting into the whys behind it as opposed to just the action. So maybe in that sense, that brings about a kindness because there's an understand, but trying to get to that, why on earth would you do that?
I'm not sure I'd describe it as a kindness per se, but I think that what is common in female character-driven crime novels and female-written crime novels is a sense that the world is not black and white, and a sense that we don't have our good as gold hero, we don't have the evil villain, and it doesn't always come good at the end. Do you know what I mean? Like so many novels that they do offer light and hope by the end, but I think they're so much more messy, and I think that potentially that comes from a sense of these women's voices and stories rising up, and they're being heard now, and what we have to say is things are so much more complicated than you think, and our experiences are so much more nuanced. And so I don't know if it's I don't know if that's kindness per se. I think it's just a really hard reality, much more so that it's a more concentrated look at the world and at culture and society than saying this guy's good, this guy's bad.
Do you think maybe it's compassion as rather than kindness, maybe compassion? Yeah, no, I'm just trying to figure out.
But as Rae said before, we can make the ending we want. So, often we don't have the power in real life, and then we get the power there.
And looking at what justice means as well, like there's criminal justice and what I mean, sometimes that doesn't really mean much, and then there's that social justice and there's many layers of how you can find a sense of justice, which I think are interesting.
As a reader for many years, I wonder what heroic crime novelists you have read or admire from the past.
Oh, that's a lovely
question. I'm thinking of Simenon, for instance. I can't remember Arthur Upfield. Such mostly men, of course. But
yes, but there is Agatha Christie always. Agatha Christie.
So, kind of book recommendations, people books that you've read and love that perhaps reflects changing roles.
Recently, Sarah Foster's The Hush. It's like a multi-generational thriller, which I really loved. The reflection of different generations, and it's celebrating the power of female friendship. So,
well, and Candice Fox, who's here in the audience, who
take a bow, Foxy.
Great crime thrillers that you can't, barely you can stop to breathe in those ones. So.
I'm going to say Anna Downs, who's written 2 fantastic books, which they're probably downstairs, The Safe Place and The Shadow House, that really looks into these issues that we've all been talking about in such great depth and nuance.
That's so kind, thank you. And did you want to ask a question? Sorry, it's okay. No.
I just wondered if any of you were only sort of, like you mentioned that you won an award. So is
shortlisted.
Sorry, you're shortlisted. Well, that's pretty close. So was that your first entrance, or did you previously? Has anybody had to self-publish or anything like that? Or have you had any, success with that? I mean, it's obviously not the route most people want to go down.
So mine was self-published when it was shortlisted.
Okay.
It's an incredible story of how you did get to traditional publishing. I love it. I love Rae's story. Nutshell. Go.
So I put it out there. I had an agent. She was really excited about it. There were crickets was the response from the publishers. I went and did a mentorship with Catherine Hayman, rewrote it, and got another agent out of that. And she put it out, and then there was a bit of interest, but I got sick with rheumatoid arthritis. And so for 2 years, I was in and out of hospital. And at the end of that, I just went, to my agent, right, I'm ready to go. And she said, I'm sorry, I'm closing my agency. And I just went, oh. And then I went, I just want this book out. I want to put it out, put it behind me and get on to the next one. So I did. And I was really lucky. I had amazing responses, got good reviews. And then it was picked up by Belinda for an audiobook, which was really exciting because that then meant I was hybrid published. And then it was shortlisted. And from that, I got an agent and a publishing deal, 2-book publishing deal with HarperCollins.
It's a great story, an example of never give up. I think that is all we have time for today. So just, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for coming. I'd like to say thank you to Rae and Petronella and Anna and to Bad Crime 22 for having us and giving us the opportunity to talk about women's stories today. We really appreciate it. It's been an amazing discussion. Before you give them a round of applause, I do just want to say that we will all be available to sign copies of our books opposite the library bookshop in the Macquarie Street building opposite the cafe. We do ask you to leave the room at the end of the session, even if your next session is in this room, as it needs to be cleared. Any problems with that, please see our volunteers and enjoy the rest of the festival. And thank you so much. Thank you.